So obviously they didn't want war in the beginning. They did everything they could. They actually were willing to have a significant negotiated concession prior to this war. Now, afterwards, of course, they're saying, yeah, now then we're in the driver's seat. We have the leverage and the flexibility with the Strait of Hormuz and all that. But they also have some other issues on top of them. So while this has been going on, and they're still willing to say, we're not going to have a nuclear weapon because that's been their policy since 2003. So that's an easy one for them. But then how's this going to get over with? And that's a bigger problem, especially with two big issues. One is with Lebanon, and then number two is with the control of the Strait of Hormuz after this period is over. And on those two issues, I think Iran is not in a very giving mood. As a matter of fact, the potential to go back to war if we don't, quote, get what we want, as many in the administration have said. Professor Morandi, who I know has been a friend of both of ours on our shows, but tweeted this out just today, actually. He said, Iran is rapidly positioning itself for any scenario. Across the country, it is expanding underground facilities, that's important, expanding, while simultaneously ramping up both offensive missile and drone capabilities on land and at sea, alongside its defensive infrastructure. So if we can argue pretty compellingly that it was the underground facilities in both drone and missile fire that allowed them to weather everything that the United States and Israel brought on top of them, and has allowed them to maintain that death grip on the control of the Strait of Hormuz, if they're now expanding that stuff, is there any prospect that we could go back to a war later to finish the job?
Well, I guess what the Iranians are doing is making the the military option even less feasible for the U.S., because I think they recognize the U.S. is in a difficult spot now. That is, Trump has essentially a memorandum of understanding in front of him, which is signed, but which he can't actually implement. He's not going to give $300 billion to Iran. He's not going to, normalize relations with Iran. So it's very unlikely that this will actually be followed through. Again, it's a great step. It can be beneficial for Iran that it was signed. It recognizes it's a new elevated position, but overall, I think that they recognize this is mainly to buy time. That is, this was the Russian experience as well. That is, you sign a peace agreement, you buy some time to reorganize, regroup, and possibly strike again. I don't think anything has fundamentally shifted. It's not as if Trump is now accepting to live next to Iran as an equal. I think there's still a hegemonic objective here, that is to knock out this key adversary in the Middle East. Again, Vance even gave an interview where he was suggesting that, this memorandum of understanding is a good thing. It gives us, alleviates the pressure on the global markets. We get some oil coming through. I mean, these are all reasonable arguments, but these are arguments for a temporary ceasefire, not an actual peace. So, yeah. And indeed, but just based on their experience, I mean, the Iranians, they signed the JCPOA. Under this agreement, they say that the United States didn't actually deliver on its commitments, and then they walked away from it. That is the American side. And then, of course, you had two negotiations which were used simply to make the Iranians lower the guard, so the U.S. could launch a surprise attack. So, and of course, they're looking towards Russia. They had the same with the Minsk agreement, and then with the Alaska meeting. So it just seems that every time that diplomacy isn't a way of solving conflicts, it's just a way of managing conflict. That is to put a temporary pause. And so, yeah, I don't have any information about what extent Iran is expanding its military infrastructure. It's very possibly true. I wouldn't have any information on this, but I think they also look towards the U.S. with some concern. That is, that perhaps the U.S. concludes we can't knock out Iran today, but perhaps they would like to shape the battlefield, make it more favorable. So put a pin in the war and then finish off Lebanon first. That is to knock out Hezbollah, and then possibly Iraq as well. Put some pressure on the government there to get rid of any pro-Iranian groups, and again, begin to shape the region more favorable for the United States in preparation of the next strike. So I think that this is what probably the Iranians recognize, that this is no peace. But if there's a temporary pause, they would take opportunity of this as well to prepare for the next war.
Yeah, and that's certainly, obviously, Iran is no longer in any confusion about, and I think that's their absolute. I mean, they'd be fools not to absolutely expect that. Be surprised if it doesn't happen, but certainly expect it. There's another issue, though, that's animating the Iranian side. I'd like your view on how this would affect even the attempt to get even if on paper an agreement as a result of this MOU here. And that is, we don't give it much thought in the West. In fact, we don't give it any thought at all. And that is the fact that we started this not just by killing 185 children and little girls and teachers in that school, but also in assassinating their senior leader on day one. And while we don't think about either of those two things, they are both very much poignant in the Iranian people and in their government how they're going to resolve this. Here is how the chief diplomat, the chief negotiator, Ghalibaf, put it on Iranian television.
خب اگه توافق داد پیگیری می‌کنیم توافق نکرد بهش میگم خونخواهی امام ما آزادی قدسه ما باید سرزمین لبنان حفظش کنیم با شعار که خونخواهی گرفته نمیشه با قدرت چون این دشمن ما جز زبان قدرت چیزی دیگه فهم نداره.
So he's saying that we don't understand anything but the language of force, and we're going to avenge the blood of our martyrs. And he specifically said we're going to hold on to Lebanon, which is point number one in the memorandum. But point number one in the memorandum said Israel would have to cease the war and I guess withdraw. But they're saying we want to hold on to that. Israel is saying we're going to hold on to that. They've been emphatic about that at both Netanyahu and the Israel Katz levels. So how do we square that circle?
No, and well, I have to say though that the Israelis they play this very, very nicely or well done. That is by making this agreement with the Lebanese government, because well, not only did they set up Lebanon for possible civil war, in which the Lebanese army, which instead of defending the southern parts of Lebanon, could be used against Israel's enemies, that is Hezbollah and other supporters. So yeah, this was done, I guess, quite shrewdly. There was a good move, not from a normative or moral perspective. But no, I think it doesn't change anything. They're not going to surrender Lebanon to Israel anyways. So, and again, this was also the first point in the Memorandum of Understanding, the idea that Lebanon's sovereignty should be respected. So, but regarding the language, I mean, this is, I think there was some comments from Vance or some other people from the administration that when they met with the Iranians that they were still kind of hostile towards the US. But that's, this isn't just, a computer game. This is, their country has been really bombed and there's a lot of death and destructions have been delivered. I mean, if there's Americans, they remember back at the September 11 attacks, how that stirs up emotions. Imagine the whole country being bombed to an extent, 185 young schoolgirls being slaughtered. And it's just, there's a lot of anger. And again, you don't know if this is what motivates the political leadership or if they're just speaking to this because they know that the population is angry. But either way, it's going to be very, I wouldn't assume that they will be as accommodating in the future as they're now, because keep in mind that the Iranians have hawks as well, and their main hawks, what have they been? Why did they oppose the MOU, the Iranian hawks? Because they said there's no way that the Americans will ever implement this. They will just take advantage of the pause to regroup and attack again. And why would we accept this? Now we're in a stronger position, so why would we give them this breathing space, regroup and attack? And now essentially the Hawks will be greatly empowered because that's exactly what's happening. So they will be proven right. The people who are talking about peace, diplomacy, they will be proven wrong. Again, there's a lot of parallels to the war with Russia, because this is what the Europeans keep saying. Oh, we need a ceasefire. But everyone knows this is not going to be used for negotiations. This will be used to arm Ukraine and prolong the war. Everyone knows this, and so I think this is the thinking in Iran. But one has to think, well, what happens? What's the consequence of this? Well, it's a bit like the bombing when they killed Khamenei, and then the son comes in. He doesn't have the same apprehensions about nuclear weapons. He also has probably a bit more anger in his heart after his mother, father, I think it was wife or one of his
and daughter, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So much of his family was killed in these attacks. The country's has been bombed. So it's going to be very difficult to go back to the way things were. And this is what often happens in war. One tends to embolden the more hawkish elements in society. And I don't think Iran's going to be a different case at all.
You know, you mentioned a minute ago about some things that Vice President Vance said about the MOU and how that tails into exactly what you were saying is from the war hawk side on the Iranian side. I'm gonna play that in case anybody has missed it, but listen to it with an additional set of ears, because and there's a number of sound bites that J.D. Vance made just yesterday. He made a speech, and then he also had an interview, and I'm going to show you a few excerpts from that, because there's a combination of things he says that on the one hand it makes it look like, you alluded to this at the opening of the show, that there's some maybe even outright conflict within the administration, maybe even between the president and the vice president, on what the exit strategy is and what we're trying to get done, because J.D. Vance here is going to kind of change the outward requirements for how we get out of this. But there's also some problems with what he says. Here's one of them.
What the president has told us to do is use this MOU to sort of refill the world's oil economy, to refill some stocks, and then to see where the hand is. If the Iranians are willing to make the commitments that we would like them to make and are willing to back those up with verifiable milestones, then we are going to change our relationship with Iran. And if they don't do that, then nothing has really changed except for what we've already accomplished from the military campaign, which is a lot.
Now, interesting, and there is what he didn't say as much as what he did say. The first part, I think, literally gave just juice to the war hawkish side on the Iranian side, because they said, look, this MOU wasn't about reaching the settlement. It was just to refill oil stocks because that was a real problem for the West. Now they're going to do that. They're going to see. But then Vance said something different here than what Trump and some of the other war hawks on the American side have said was, and if they don't do what we say here, the hawks say, we'll go back to bombing and finish the job, et cetera. But Vance said there, and if they don't, well, we've already accomplished some things anyway, implying we could just walk away. How do you read that?
Well, that's what I meant. I don't think there's a clear strategy in place. If you ask Trump, what is the plan here? If you can't get a deal with the Iranians, will he bomb again, or just call it a day by having say that you destroyed so much in Iran? This death killing represents victory. So I don't think really they decided yet, and I think it also reflects some of the divisions within the administration. Again, the MAGA putting America first. I think this has been severely split by this war, and indeed it was all the wars, because the US wasn't supposed to do this regime change wars anymore. And I think Vance, obviously, he belongs more to the more actual America firsters, the ones who wanted to put an end to the war, who didn't want to put Israel ahead of the United States. And you saw this with the attacks on Yemen. Again, this is early last year, but still, he was the one who didn't care for this. He believed this wasn't the responsibility of the United States. The Europeans could do this if they would want. He's been the one who's been most critical of continuing America's involvement in the proxy war in Ukraine. And he also was more hesitant about the war against Iran. So I think, a lot of them are probably pushing in this direction, which is why when Trump escalated his language against Israel, Vance and others saw an opportunity that this could, that they could create some space between the U.S. and Israel, so the U.S. would have some more room for maneuver to not have to always align its policies along with Israel. So, no, I think it's quite clear that there are divisions, but this is to be expected. The way I interpret this, Vance and that brand of America First, they represent essentially the groups who are recognize that the world has shifted. The distribution of power has gone away from a global primacy towards multipolarity, and they're trying to chart the best possible path forward for the United States based on this. And then you have the more hawkish America first, which suggests that if we just destroy our rivals, then America will be dominant again, and this is America first, essentially. So it's very different views, and but again, even the Doves, if you want to put Vance in that camp, still make this point of that. Yeah, well, we signed it so we get some pause, open up the markets, allow some oil to go through. Again, it will be good for us, and so it's as you said, you can imagine how this plays in Iran, because you don't need the elaborate propaganda from the Iranian side when the U.S. leadership is
here it is on a golden platter.
Yeah, just right. play on their unedited what they're saying, and that's that's all you need.
Yeah, it's certainly how it's working out so far. Vance, I'm going to show you a couple of clips here where Vance really seems to be taking the opportunity to, if not put some daylight between him and that other more hawkish version of the America First, destroy everybody that you don't like, and takes it pretty much to task here and to create some, I think it's create some division and pushback. Here's one where he's a little bit more, I guess, diplomatic about it, where he says, hey, about those war hawks.
What's happening right now is he's letting those options play out in an environment where there is significantly less pressure on the world energy economy. My biggest frustration with right-wing critics of what we've done over the last few months in Iran is that they don't realize how completely they were losing the political argument because of what was happening to world energy markets. Yeah. So what the President of the United States has done...
You're talking about the critics who want more bombs dropping on.
Their attitude is just drop bombs, and they can't really articulate to what end. What the President is saying, I'm willing to drop bombs, and he's clearly shown that he's willing to drop bombs, but only if it serves an objective. And so what he's doing right now is taking a lot of pressure off of the world economy, the world energy economy in particular, while not giving up a single one of his gains and while preserving a lot of optionality. I think that's a very good place for us to be in.
And you can certainly take issue with the last part there about all these gains that we apparently won here, but he's not wrong about the fact that there was economic pressure that compelled this. As a matter of fact, one of the things President Trump mentioned when he signed the MOU and first was actually referred here by Chris Martenson. He said, if we do a responsible drawdown of our strategic petroleum reserve, this was like 2 days ago, we have until October 4th before the U.S. runs out of oil. If the Department of War minimizes minimums are observed, which allocates 243 million barrels for military only use, then we only have at current rates up until July the 10th. So just 10 days from now. So that does show that there is a lot of pressure on us to make a difference or to make a change here. And that is a very legitimate argument against the war hawkers, who have been saying, like Mike Pompeo, like Jack Keane, like General Kellogg, they say, let's go back. We're going to have to take it from them, the Strait of Hormuz. And they have no plan for this. How does this strike you as somebody in the Western world on the European side, when you hear these guys still saying to this day, we need to go back and finish the job when we couldn't finish it the first time when we had every advantage in the world?
Well, I think it's just more of the same. You have seen this enough of this over the decades now. This was also what they said in Afghanistan. Well, let's just give our troops some more time, and they will finish the job. And then they cover up the weaknesses. But essentially, there was no clear path to victory. Yet they kept it going for 20 years. Same in Iraq. There was no good pathway to victory, so they kept it going. And eventually, at the end of the day, it just ends up with a very painful decision, which is the only way you can put an end to this is to walk away. This was, the Vietnam experience as well. So, yes. No, I don't think they have a good solution. It's just let's continue bombing, and because we can't afford to walk away. And I get why the outcome of this is not ideal. Indeed, this is not even going back to the status quo. The status quo is gone. This is going to elevate Iran's position significantly in the Middle East. If it holds on to the Strait of Hormuz, then this is a huge source of influence, and a lot of the Gulf states will have to adjust to this new reality. So America's role in the Middle East could be severely diminished as a result. So I understand why it's not appealing, so they don't want it, but if you go to war with a huge country like Iran, one needs a clear strategy. What to expect to achieve? How will you achieve it? And as you said, I haven't seen any plan. Meanwhile, it can cause a lot of economic pain if they continue this. But with any other conflict, you want to assess your opponents. To what extent they impose. Well, they are a threat, and usually we would assess this by assessing their intentions and capabilities. And I think you can do the same to conclude why you can't defeat the Iranians. First of all, the main problem is open up the Strait of Hormuz. Exactly how is this going to be done? Even if you're able to hold it open for a day, what happens tomorrow? They can close it off again. A lot of the weapons, they're cheaply produced. These are cheap drones. It's a very narrow strait. It's very easy to close it down with cheap weapons. One can show up with big ships and force through a tanker or two, and then spend all of these expensive interceptor missiles to take out very cheap drones, which isn't sustainable. But again, it asks the question of what happens tomorrow. It doesn't make any sense. So there's nothing one can do to really undermine the Iranian capabilities. Also, because the production facilities, they're not huge factories which can be bombed because of the fairly simple technology and production. It can be very much decentralized. So one can't really take out the capabilities. Also, the Iranians have huge inventory. So that's the capabilities. One can't really do anything about this. One can brag, all day long about how they don't have a navy or an air force, or we destroyed everything. But even if that was true, they don't need a huge navy or an air force in order to close the Strait of Hormuz. And the second aspect besides capabilities would be the intentions. So, and this is also an area I think they underestimated, which is the idea if we just bring enough death and destruction on the Iranians, then they will essentially capitulate. Well, I think that fails to recognize that this is an existential threat for the Iranians. They know that it's not just the government, but Iran itself could be destroyed. It could be balkanized. It could become another Libya or Syria or whatever we've been doing in that region. So given that it's an existential threat, the Iranians are willing to absorb a lot of pain in order to keep, to make sure that they don't lose this war. So with this cheap capabilities, easy to produce, decentralized, and the willingness to absorb a lot of pain, how exactly does one intend to defeat Iran? I think, this is a reasonable question, and it should be answered before committing the United States to what would likely be another disaster.
And if I can just add on there, not only does Iran have the ability to absorb a lot of pain, they have the ability to issue a lot of pain too. And we have seen that to our pain. And I don't know why these people keep forgetting that. We can only speculate.